What's the most unsettling thing you've seen someone bring to show and tell? I was picking up my daughter from elementary school when the principal pulled me aside. Mrs. Newman, we need to discuss what Naima brought for show and tell today. My stomach dropped. Naima was 7 and had been secretive about what she'd packed in her backpack that morning. She'd insisted it was a surprise and I'd been running late for work, so I hadn't pressed the issue. What did she bring? Principal Braxton led me to her office where Naima sat swinging her legs, looking perfectly pleased with herself. On the desk was a small wooden box I recognized from our attic. My grandmother's jewelry box that I thought was locked in storage. She brought what she claims are her great-great-grandmother's teeth. I stared at the open box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were indeed human teeth. 6 of them, yellowed with age. Each had a small tag attached with dates written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. 1943, 1951, 1958, 1962, 1967, 1971. Naima, where did you get this? From the secret room in our basement, behind the water heater. We didn't have a secret room. Our basement was unfinished concrete and exposed pipes. I'd been down there countless times doing laundry. There was nothing behind the water heater except wall. She told quite a story to her class, Principal Braxton continued, about how these teeth belonged to people who disappeared, how her great-great-grandmother was a detective who solved mysteries. Naima nodded enthusiastically. She caught bad people and kept their teeth as evidence. I apologized profusely and took the box. At home, I went straight to the basement with Naima trailing behind. She pushed past me and pressed on what looked like a normal wall panel. It swung inward, revealing a narrow space I'd never known existed. Inside were filing cabinets, photo albums, and dozens more small boxes. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, photos, and handwritten notes. Everything dated from the 1940s through the 1970s. My grandmother's name appeared on several documents. See? I told you, Naima said. Grandma Sage was a detective. But looking closer, I realized this wasn't detective work. These were missing person cases, unsolved disappearances, and each box of teeth corresponded to a name on the wall. People who'd vanished without explanation in our small town over 30 years. One album contained photos of my grandmother with various people. Normal-looking snapshots at diners, parks, and shops. But each person in the photos had a red X drawn over their face. The same people whose names were on the tooth boxes. Naima, how long have you known about this room? Since we moved in, the lady told me about it. What lady? The one who lives down here. She's very old. She said she's been waiting for someone to find her work. My blood went cold. We'd been in this house for 3 years. Just Naima and me after the divorce. I found a leather journal and opened it. My grandmother's handwriting filled every page. Names, dates, locations. But these weren't case notes. They were confessions. Detailed accounts of how she'd stalked people who'd wronged her or her family. How she'd planned their disappearances. My grandmother who'd made cookies and taught me to knit. She'd been hunting people for sport, and I'd never known. The lady says I'm just like Grandma Sage, Naima announced. She's teaching me things. I grabbed Naima's hand and headed for the stairs. We needed to leave. Call the police. Figure out what to do about the evidence of multiple murders hidden in our home. But Naima pulled back. We can't leave yet. The lady hasn't shown me everything. There is no lady, Naima. It's just us here. Naima smiled the way children do when adults miss something obvious. She's right behind you. I turned around. The basement was empty except for washing machines and storage boxes. But the temperature had dropped noticeably, and I smelled something floral. My grandmother's perfume. She says you're not ready to understand. But I am. That's why she picked me. I dragged Naima upstairs and locked the basement door. My hands shook as I called my mother, demanding to know about Grandma Sage. Mom was quiet for a long time before answering. I hoped you'd never find that room. We sealed it when she died. Promised to keep her secrets. You knew? You knew she was a serial killer? She wasn't a killer. She was protecting our family. Every person she took had hurt one of us. The man who assaulted your aunt. The woman who destroyed your grandfather's business. The teacher who touched children. She handled things her way. And the teeth? Proof. In case anyone ever doubted her work was justified. I hung up, horrified. My entire family had known and let me raise my daughter in a house containing evidence of murders. And now Naima was talking to someone who wasn't there, learning family traditions I'd never wanted passed down. That night, I started packing. We'd stay in a hotel until I figured out next steps. But when I went to get Naima, her room was empty. Her window was closed and locked. No sign of struggle. Just gone. I ran through the house screaming her name. Finally, I heard humming from the basement. The door I'd locked was standing open. I crept down the stairs and found Naima in the secret room, carefully arranging items on a shelf. The lady says it's time to start my collection, she said without turning around. She then held up a small wooden box, newly labeled with today's date. Inside was a fresh tooth, still pink at the root. Adult-sized. I noticed blood on Naima's school uniform. Naima, whose tooth is that? She smiled at me with that same pleased look from the school and held the box up like it was some kind of prize. It's from Mr. Henderson next door. My legs almost gave out when I realized she was talking about our old neighbor who lived alone and never bothered anyone. I grabbed her shoulders and tried to keep my voice steady even though my mind was racing with panic. Naima, what did you do to Mr. Henderson? She tilted her head like I was asking something silly. I didn't hurt him, Mommy. I just took what we needed for evidence after the lady made him sleep. She pointed to the empty corner where the air felt coldest, and I could still smell that flowery perfume. She's teaching me how Grandma did it with special tea that makes people very tired. I scooped her up even though she squirmed and complained and ran up those basement stairs as fast as I could. The door slammed behind us and I turned the deadbolt with shaking fingers. My phone was on the counter and I grabbed it while still holding Naima with one arm. The numbers blurred as I tried to dial 911 and find words that wouldn't make me sound completely crazy. There's evidence of old murders in my basement and I think my neighbor might be hurt. The dispatcher's calm voice asked me to slow down and explain what was happening. I watched Naima sit at the kitchen table humming that old song my grandmother always sang while folding laundry. I told the woman on the phone about the room full of teeth and the blood on my daughter's uniform and begged her to send someone to check on Henderson right away. She said units were on their way and to stay on the line, but I could barely hear her over my own heartbeat. 2 police cars pulled up within minutes and their lights painted red and blue stripes across our kitchen walls. I met them at the door still holding Naima's hand tight, while she waved at something behind me that I couldn't see. The officers split up with 2 heading next door to Henderson's place while 2 stayed with us asking questions. A shout came from next door, and one officer's radio crackled with urgent words about needing an ambulance immediately. They'd found him unconscious but still breathing with a missing tooth and a cup of weird tea on his nightstand. The officer with us looked at Naima with this mix of confusion and worry that made my stomach twist even more. More cars arrived and Detective Irving Strong walked in with a weathered face that looked like he'd seen everything. But maybe not this. He listened to my jumbled explanation about the basement room, and my grandmother, and the ghost teaching my daughter to hurt people. He sent officers down to secure the basement while calling for forensics and child protective services on his phone. "We need to document everything before we disturb the scene," he said in this gentle voice that somehow made things feel slightly less insane. Myrtle Scott from CPS showed up looking tired but alert, and went straight to Naima, who was still way too calm for a kid in this situation. She knelt down to Naima's level and asked if she was hurt anywhere, or if anyone had touched her in bad ways. Naima shook her head and said in this matter-of-fact voice that made my skin crawl, "The lady is upset that you're all here. Because you're ruining everything." I tried to explain to Myrtle about the ghost, or whatever it was that Naima kept seeing and talking to down in that basement. I told her how Naima said this thing was teaching her to continue my grandmother's work of collecting teeth from bad people. Myrtle exchanged this look with Detective Strong that said they'd dealt with troubled kids before, but probably nothing quite like this. She pulled out her phone and said we needed to get Naima evaluated by a specialist immediately for her own safety. The basement door opened and officers came up looking pale and talking in low voices about what they'd found down there. Strong went to talk to them while Myrtle kept asking Naima gentle questions about the lady and what she'd been learning. Naima answered like she was talking about a favorite teacher, explaining how the lady showed her which people were bad and how to make the special tea. She said the lady had been waiting so long for someone who understood the important work. My mother's words from earlier echoed in my head about family secrets and protecting each other, but this wasn't protection. This was my 7-year-old daughter being groomed by something evil to become a killer like my grandmother. The forensics van pulled up outside and people in white suits started carrying equipment into the house. Strong came back and said they needed us to leave while they processed the scene, but we couldn't go far. Myrtle suggested the crisis center where they had people who could help kids in emergency situations. I packed bags with shaking hands while Naima sat on her bed talking to empty air about how the lady shouldn't be mad because they'd find other ways to continue the work. The words made me want to grab her and run as far from this town as possible, but I knew we needed help. Professional help from people who knew how to deal with whatever was happening to my little girl. As we walked to Myrtle's car, neighbors stood on their porches watching the police and ambulance lights with that look people get when they realize something terrible happened right next door. The forensics van doors opened and people in white suits started carrying equipment boxes into my house, while more neighbors gathered to watch. Eugene Gomez came up from the basement 20 minutes later, carrying several evidence bags, and his face looked grim. He pulled Detective Strong aside, but I could hear him saying they'd found at least 30 boxes of teeth down there, each one labeled with dates and names going back decades. The newest tooth still had blood and tissue stuck to it, which made my stomach turn. Strong came back over and asked me to sit down so he could ask some questions about my family, while Myrtle pulled out coloring books from her bag to keep Naima busy. I told him everything I knew about my grandmother being some kind of detective, and how my mother had just told me on the phone that she knew about the murders all along. He wrote everything down in his notebook without judging me, and asked me to slow down when I started talking too fast. The house had always felt wrong to me, but I'd ignored it because the rent was cheap after the divorce. Naima suddenly started crying real tears for the first time all night. "The lady is so angry," she wailed. "She says I'm her special girl and you're taking me away from our important work." The temperature in the living room dropped. So fast I could see my breath and 3 picture frames fell off the wall at the same time, glass breaking on the floor. Myrtle looked at Strong and said we needed to get Naima out of this house right now for her own safety. She explained there was a family crisis center about 10 minutes away where specialists could evaluate Naima while the police processed the scene. I ran upstairs and threw clothes into bags for both of us, grabbing Naima's favorite stuffed animals and my laptop. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely zip the bags, but I was so grateful to be leaving this house even if it was just temporary. We were walking out to Myrtle's car when my mother's sedan screeched into the driveway and she jumped out looking furious. She tried to block our path to the car and grabbed my arm hard. "You don't understand what you're doing," she hissed at me. "Some secrets protect us and you're destroying everything our family built." Detective Strong stepped between us and firmly moved my mother's hand off my arm. He told her she'd need to come to the station for questioning about her knowledge of Grandma Sage's activities, and her face went white as paper. She glared at me like I'd betrayed generations of women before me and spit on the ground at my feet. Strong put his hand on her shoulder and guided her toward his unmarked car, while she kept turning back to stare at me with pure hatred. The crisis center was a plain brick building that looked like any office complex from the outside, but inside it had soft lighting and comfortable furniture. Adelaide Coulter met us in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes who introduced herself as a child psychologist. She took Naima into a playroom while I watched through a two-way mirror that looked like a regular window from Naima's side. Naima sat at a small table and started drawing with the markers Adelaide gave her, making picture after picture of a tall woman in an old-fashioned dress. She told Adelaide the lady had been teaching her special things since we moved into the house 3 years ago, and showed her all the secret places. Adelaide asked gentle questions while Naima drew the lady standing behind her in every picture, with long fingers on Naima's shoulders. After an hour, Adelaide came out to talk to me while another staff member stayed with Naima. She explained that Naima was showing signs of either a severe dissociative disorder from trauma or possibly genuine supernatural influence, though she was careful to say she couldn't rule anything out yet. The immediate concern was breaking whatever hold this entity or delusion had over my daughter before it caused more harm. She wanted to run more tests and have Naima stay at the center for at least a few days of intensive observation. My phone rang and it was Detective Strong calling with an update about our neighbor. Mr. Henderson was stable at the hospital but confused, with no memory of losing his tooth or how it happened. They'd found a journal in Naima's room, though, filled with notes in a child's handwriting about people who hurt others and needed to be collected like Grandma Sage did. Some pages had much fancier handwriting, like an adult had been guiding her hand to write. That night, I slept on a cot in the room next to Naima's at the crisis center. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to screaming and found Naima trying to open the locked door while still asleep. "The lady is calling me home," she cried. "I need to go back or she'll be so mad at me." She tried to push past me toward the door, but the security system kept it locked tight. I held her while she thrashed and begged the lady to forgive her for leaving, for telling the secrets, for being a bad student. It took an hour for her to calm down enough to fall back asleep, and I stayed awake the rest of the night watching her breathe and wondering how I'd missed all the signs that something evil had been teaching my baby girl to hurt people. The next morning, Eugene showed up at the crisis center with a thick folder and a grim expression on his face. He spread out papers on the conference room table while Adelaide and I looked at the evidence they'd gathered from our basement. The teeth matched missing persons reports from the 1940s through 1970s, each victim having some connection to our family, like a teacher who'd given my mother bad grades or a neighbor who'd complained about noise. Eugene pulled out a pink notebook covered in unicorn stickers that made my stomach drop because I'd bought it for Naima last month. Inside were pages of her shaky handwriting listing kids from her class with notes about why they were mean, including a boy who wouldn't share his crayons and a girl who called her weird. Some pages had different handwriting layered over hers, like someone had been guiding her hand to write more detailed plans about watching and waiting. Adelaide studied the notebook and told me Naima needed more intensive help than the crisis center could provide. She recommended a specialized children's facility 2 hours north that dealt with severe trauma and behavioral issues. The distance would help break whatever connection existed between Naima and the house, giving her space to heal without the entity's influence. I signed the paperwork immediately, even though my hands shook at the thought of being separated from my daughter for weeks or months. My phone started ringing nonstop with calls from my mother, who'd been released from police custody that morning. The detectives couldn't prove she'd actively participated in any murders, just that she'd known about them and kept quiet. Her voicemails got more frantic as the day went on, saying I was destroying our family legacy and ruining Naima's special gift that had been passed down through generations. She claimed I didn't understand the important work our family had done to protect the community from bad people. I blocked her number and changed my phone settings to send unknown callers straight to voicemail. Detective Strong called to say he'd arranged for both a priest and a medium to examine the house, though I could hear the skepticism in his voice about bringing in paranormal investigators. The priest went through first, blessing each room and reporting an oppressive feeling in the basement that made him physically sick. The medium arrived separately, and without knowing what the priest had said, described the exact same sensations, plus the clear presence of an elderly woman who was furious about being discovered after keeping her secrets safe for so long. Both recommended the house be cleansed or even demolished to break whatever hold the entity had over the property. Adelaide drove Naima to the therapy facility while I followed in my car, watching my daughter stare out the window without speaking. At intake, Naima crossed her arms and refused to answer questions or eat the lunch they offered, whispering that the lady had warned her not to trust anyone there because they wanted to make her forget her important training. Adelaide stayed patient, setting up art supplies and playing quiet music while Naima glared at the wall. For 3 days, Naima barely ate or spoke, just sitting in her room drawing the same tall figure over and over. Adelaide worked with her using play therapy, letting Naima control toy figures while gently asking questions about the lady and what she'd been teaching. On the 3rd night, Naima finally broke down crying and admitted she was scared because the lady would be mad at her for talking, but she was also scared of what the lady wanted her to do next. She said the lady kept showing her images of kids at the school who needed to be collected, but Naima didn't want to hurt anyone even if they were mean sometimes. Adelaide called this a major breakthrough and increased their session frequency. I met with a family law attorney whose office walls were covered in degrees and who listened to my story with widening eyes. She helped me file for restraining orders against my mother and any other relatives who might try to contact Naima, saying she'd never handled a case involving generational serial killing before. We also started paperwork to legally change our names and discussed relocating to another state once the investigation wrapped up. The lawyer said courts were usually sympathetic to protecting children from dangerous family situations, and she expected the orders to be approved quickly. Eugene called while I was driving back from the lawyer with news that made me pull over to process what he was saying. They'd found records showing my grandmother's mother had been connected to similar disappearances in the early 1900s, with newspaper clippings about missing people who'd all somehow wronged the family. Census records and old police reports suggested this pattern went back at least 4 generations, with each woman training the next to carry on the tradition. Historical societies had dozens of unsolved cases that matched the pattern, all in towns where my family had lived. During Naima's next therapy session, Adelaide showed me a drawing that made my chest tight with hope and fear. Naima had drawn herself standing between me and the lady, literally torn down the middle with half of her reaching toward each of us. She'd told Adelaide the lady said I didn't understand our family's important work protecting people, but Naima loved me and didn't want to hurt me or disappoint me either. Adelaide explained this showed Naima was starting to recognize the conflict between what the entity wanted and her love for me, which was essential for breaking the hold. The police expanded their investigation by bringing ground-penetrating radar equipment to scan our entire property. The machines picked up multiple anomalies in the backyard that looked like human remains buried at different depths, some appearing decades old based on soil disturbance patterns. The entire property became an active crime scene with yellow tape everywhere, and officers cataloging evidence 24 hours a day. Our landlord started eviction proceedings immediately, though that was the least of my worries. Detective Strong went back to interview Mr. Henderson once he'd recovered more from whatever Naima had given him. The old man remembered Naima bringing him tea and homemade cookies, saying her grandma's special recipe would help with his arthritis pain. He'd thought it was sweet that such a young girl cared about his health problems. The last thing he remembered was feeling drowsy and seeing an elderly woman in an old-fashioned dress standing behind Naima, though he lived alone and hadn't invited anyone else into his house. He couldn't explain how the woman got there or why Naima would have been able to drug him, but the tooth was definitely his, and the gap in his mouth proved it. Adelaide started working with Naima on something new the next week at the facility. She had Naima practice saying no to the lady's voice, which scared my daughter so badly she hid under the therapy room table at first. Adelaide stayed calm and patient, sitting on the floor near Naima and talking softly about how the lady couldn't actually hurt her from so far away. It took 3 sessions before Naima would even try saying no out loud. When she finally did it, her whole body shook and she kept looking around the room like she expected something terrible to happen. Adelaide asked her to refuse when the voice told her to draw another list of bad people at the facility. Naima's face went white and she whispered no, so quietly we could barely hear it. Then she burst into tears and crawled into Adelaide's lap, sobbing that the lady would be so angry with her. Adelaide held her and told her how brave she was, how proud we all were. I watched through the observation window with my own tears running down my face. 2 days later, the police showed up at my hotel with more questions about my mother. They'd found old evidence in the basement linking her to helping dispose of bodies back in the 70s when she was just a teenager. Detective Strong explained they had photos of her with Grandma at several burial sites, plus her handwriting on some of the documentation. They arrested her that afternoon at her house. The whole thing made the evening news and suddenly everyone in town knew about our family. People stared at me at the grocery store and whispered behind their hands. The cashier at the gas station asked if I was the one whose grandmother killed all those people. I stopped going out except for absolute necessities. I found a therapist who specialized in trauma and started going twice a week. Dr. Martinez had me talk through my whole childhood, looking for signs I'd missed. Once I started really thinking about it, the pieces fell into place. Grandma's visitors who came for dinner, but never came back for seconds. The way certain families crossed the street when they saw us coming. Those weird lessons about justice and protecting family that seemed normal at the time but really weren't. The camping trips where Grandma taught me to track animals, but now I wondered if she was teaching me to track people. How she always knew everyone's business in town, their schedules and routines. Meanwhile, Naima was making real progress at the facility. During our next session, Adelaide explained that Naima had told her something important. Sometimes the lady's voice sounded exactly like Naima's own thoughts, making it impossible to tell what was real and what was the entity. Adelaide said this was how these presences gained control, by mimicking internal dialogue until the person couldn't distinguish their own thoughts from the invasive ones. They started working on techniques where Naima would test whether a thought was really hers by asking herself specific questions only she would know the answers to. If the voice couldn't answer correctly, she knew it wasn't really her thinking. Eugene called me with news that made me have to sit down. His team had matched one of the teeth from the 60s to a kid who supposedly drowned at summer camp when my mom was 8. The dental records were a perfect match. The kid had been bullying my mother badly that summer, pushing her off the dock and holding her underwater. The camp records showed Grandma had visited the day before the drowning. The evidence suggested she'd killed a 12-year-old boy to protect her daughter, then somehow made it look like an accident. The camp had closed the next year. I threw up after that call, thinking about Grandma murdering a child. 3 weeks into Naima's treatment, we had our first video call. She looked healthier, with color back in her cheeks and her hair neatly braided. She told me she missed me, but was glad the lady's voice was getting quieter. She'd made a friend named Sophie who liked to draw horses, and they ate lunch together every day. The night terrors had stopped, and she was sleeping through the night for the first time since this all started. Seeing her smile, really smile without that creepy knowing look, gave me hope we might actually get through this. She showed me a painting she'd made of us at the beach, something we'd never actually done but she wanted to do when she got out. Detective Strong called the next day with more news. The FBI was taking over the investigation due to how many victims and how many years were involved. The Behavioral Analysis Unit wanted to study our case as one of the only documented examples of serial killing being passed down through generations in one family. They needed me to come in for extensive interviews about everything I remembered about my family. I spent 8 hours over 2 days talking to federal agents about every memory I had of Grandma, my mother, our family dynamics. They recorded everything and had me look at hundreds of photos, asking if I recognized any of the people. Some I did, vaguely remembering them from town or family gatherings before they disappeared. The medium who'd examined our house before came back with a whole team of people who specialized in removing negative entities. They set up cameras and equipment throughout the house while I watched from outside with police protection. The ritual took 4 hours, and even from the street I could feel something happening. Every piece of electronic equipment they'd brought started sparking and shutting down at the same time. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes, and frost formed on the windows even though it was spring. The medium came out looking exhausted and told us the presence was incredibly strong and fought them the whole time. Adelaide called me that night to warn me Naima had had a really rough evening. After the cleansing ritual, even from 2 hours away, Naima had started screaming that the lady was screaming in her head, calling her a traitor and saying terrible things. They'd had to sedate her lightly to help her calm down. But by morning, something had shifted. Naima told Adelaide the voice was much weaker now, like hearing someone yelling from really far away instead of right in her ear. The ritual had worked, at least partially. I started looking for apartments in other cities, somewhere we could start fresh where nobody knew our story. I found a place 3 hours away, a nice 2-bedroom in a building with good security and a doorman. The landlord was understanding when I explained we were fleeing a dangerous situation, and didn't even ask for the usual deposits. I started the paperwork to change our names legally, which the judge approved given what he called extraordinary circumstances. I registered Naima at a new school under our new names, and explained to the principal that we were escaping family violence, which was true enough without getting into the supernatural details. 3 weeks later, the prosecutor called about my mother's case and said she'd agreed to a plea deal. I sat in the courtroom watching her stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit while the prosecutor read the charges. She'd provided them with information about 12 more victims they hadn't known about yet, bodies buried on properties our family owned decades ago. The judge accepted her guilty plea to accessory after the fact and conspiracy charges, sentencing her to 10 years with possibility of parole after 7. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, my mother looked straight at me and said the family had only ever protected itself from people who would have destroyed us. The bailiff led her away while I sat there feeling nothing but relief that she couldn't reach Naima anymore. Adelaide called that afternoon with good news about Naima's progress. She'd gone 6 straight hours without mentioning the lady during their morning session, focusing instead on a craft project Adelaide had brought. They were working on recognizing when thoughts didn't feel like her own thoughts, teaching her to pause and ask herself if this was something she really wanted to do, or if someone else was telling her to do it. Adelaide warned me this kind of recovery would take years, and we'd need to watch for relapses, but she was encouraged by how quickly Naima was learning the coping tools. The FBI agent assigned to our case visited me at the apartment to share what they'd found so far. Their team had connected our family to over 50 disappearances going back 4 generations, making it one of the biggest serial killings investigations in state history. They'd found records in the basement showing my great-great-grandmother had started the whole thing in the 1890s, passing it down mother to daughter like some twisted family recipe. Each generation got better at hiding the evidence, better at choosing victims nobody would miss right away. They were creating a task force just to identify all the victims and notify families, which would probably take years to complete. During our next family therapy session over video call, something amazing happened. Naima looked right at the camera and told me she was sorry for hurting Mr. Henderson and taking his tooth. She said she understood now that the lady had tricked her into thinking bad things were good things, like when someone tells you vegetables are candy but they're really still vegetables. Adelaide had tears in her eyes watching this 7-year-old take responsibility, while also understanding she'd been manipulated by something way beyond her control. It was the first time I'd felt real hope since finding that basement room. Detective Strong stopped by the apartment with an update about Mr. Henderson. He'd recovered completely and decided not to press any charges against Naima, understanding she was just a kid who'd been influenced by something nobody could fully explain. He was moving to Florida to live with his son, and had even sent a note forgiving Naima, and wishing us the best in our recovery. I cried reading his kind words after what my family had put him through. The city council held a meeting about the house and voted to demolish it once the investigation wrapped up. Dozens of locals showed up to share stories about family members who'd vanished over the years, people they now suspected might have been my family's victims. The council voted unanimously for demolition, calling it a public safety issue and saying the psychological impact on the community was too great to let it stand. Adelaide started preparing us for Naima's discharge, which was planned for about 6 weeks away. She taught me all the therapy techniques they'd been using, showing me how to redirect Naima when she seemed to drift or hear something that wasn't there. We practiced scenarios where the voice might come back, with me playing Naima and Adelaide showing me how to respond calmly but firmly. The plan included outpatient therapy twice a week for at least 2 years, plus monthly psychiatric check-ins to monitor her progress. I finally found a job working remotely for a tech company that didn't care about my family history, since I'd legally changed our names. The routine of normal work helped me feel grounded, gave me something to focus on besides worry. My supervisor was understanding when I explained I'd need flexibility for medical appointments, though I kept the details vague. 2 weeks before Naima was supposed to come home, we hit a setback. She'd found an old photo of Grandma that had fallen out of my wallet during our video call, and just seeing it made the lady's voice come screaming back. Naima called me crying, saying the lady was telling her she was abandoning her heritage, that she was weak and worthless without the family tradition. Adelaide worked with her for hours that day and the next, using every technique they'd developed. Within 3 days, Naima could push the voice back again, but it reminded us all how fragile her recovery still was. The day they demolished the house, local news live-streamed it since the case had gotten so much attention. I watched on my laptop while Naima was in therapy, needing to see it come down even though Adelaide advised against it. As the wrecking ball hit the walls, several people in the crowd swore they saw a dark figure in the basement window right before it collapsed. The demolition crew said the basement was harder to destroy than it should have been, like something was holding it together. They ended up having to bring in special equipment, and the rubble got hauled to a contaminated materials site instead of a regular dump, though nobody could explain exactly why that decision was made. 3 months passed before the day finally came to bring Naima home. I drove to the treatment center with my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The stuffed elephant they'd given her at intake was sitting in the back seat next to a bag of her favorite snacks. Adelaide met me in the lobby and walked me to Naima's room where she was packing the last of her things. She looked up and ran to me, clutching a different stuffed animal now, a purple bear the therapy team had given her as a graduation gift. Her room here was nothing like the one at home had been. We'd spent hours on video calls picking out decorations for her new bedroom in our apartment. She'd chosen bright yellows and greens instead of the dark purples she used to love. The drive to our new place took 2 hours, and Naima spent most of it pointing out things she saw along the way. Every red car was worth mentioning. Every dog being walked needed commenting on. Normal kid stuff that made my chest tight with hope. Our apartment building had a security door that needed a code, which made me feel safer even though I knew a door couldn't stop everything. Naima explored every corner of our new home, opening cabinets and closets like she was making sure nothing was hiding. That first week tested everything we'd learned. Tuesday morning, Naima woke up crying because she heard whispering in the walls. We sat on her bed and practiced the grounding exercises Adelaide had taught us. 5 things she could see, 4 she could touch, 3 she could hear that were real sounds. By Thursday, she was using the techniques on her own when the whispers came back during breakfast. I watched her close her eyes, take deep breaths, and count on her fingers until her breathing slowed. Friday, she asked if we could get a fish because the lady never liked animals, and having one would prove she was really gone. We went to the pet store that afternoon and came home with a betta fish she named Spark. Adelaide came to our apartment twice a week for sessions. She'd converted our spare bedroom into a makeshift therapy space with pillows on the floor and art supplies on a card table. During their second session, I heard Naima laughing for the first time in months. Adelaide emerged afterward saying Naima's progress was better than she'd hoped. The distance from the house and all its memories seemed to be breaking whatever hold that thing had on her. She showed me charts tracking Naima's episodes, and they were decreasing every week. The support group I found met Wednesday nights in a church basement 20 minutes away. I told them my family had a history of violence I'd recently discovered, leaving out the supernatural parts. One woman there had found out her father was a serial rapist. Another man's son had witnessed his mother kill his father. They shared resources for helping kids process trauma, recommended therapists who specialized in childhood PTSD, and never pushed for more details than I wanted to give. 3 different parents gave me their phone numbers and said to call anytime, day or night. Detective Strong called on a Thursday afternoon while Naima was at therapy. He'd been working with the forensics team for months identifying remains. They'd matched dental records for 43 victims so far. Families were being contacted carefully, some grateful for closure after decades of not knowing. Several wanted to meet me, but Adelaide had advised waiting until Naima was more stable. He said 2 families had already held memorial services now that they could finally bury their loved ones. The FBI task force estimated there were at least 17 more victims they hadn't identified yet. 6 months after leaving that house, Naima started at her new school. We'd worked with Adelaide to create a support plan that gave her teachers basic information without the terrifying details. They knew she had trauma in her background and might need extra patience. Her teacher, Mrs. Kim, pulled me aside after the first week to say Naima was doing better than expected. She was quiet but participated when called on. At recess, she played alone at first, but by the 3rd week, she'd joined a group of girls playing hopscotch. One girl named Maya invited her to a birthday party, and Naima actually wanted to go. We practiced what to do if she felt overwhelmed, and I stayed in my car in the parking lot the whole time, just in case. She came out holding a goodie bag and smiling about the cake that had been shaped like a unicorn. The FBI officially closed their active investigation 7 months after that night in the basement. The final report was over 300 pages, documenting 60 confirmed victims across 90 years. 4 generations of women in my family had been involved. They'd found evidence going back to my great-great-grandmother in the 1920s. The behavioral analysis team wanted to study the case for years to understand how this pattern perpetuated through generations. My mother had been in prison for 8 months when the call came. Heart attack in her cell during the night. The guards found her during morning count. I felt my legs go weak, but also something like relief washing over me. I chose not to attend the funeral even though my aunt called 6 times trying to guilt me into coming. Instead, I sat down with Naima and Adelaide to tell her in simple terms that her grandmother had died. Naima processed it quietly, then said she hoped Grandma and the lady couldn't hurt anyone where they were now. Adelaide noted this as significant progress in Naima understanding the harm that had been done. A full year after everything started, Adelaide shifted Naima's sessions to once a week. The whispers had been gone for 3 months straight. Naima still had nightmares sometimes, but she could tell the difference between regular bad dreams and trauma responses. She'd wake up and write in the journal Adelaide gave her, drawing pictures of happy things until she felt calm enough to sleep again. Detective Strong came by on a Saturday afternoon carrying a manila envelope. He was retiring in 2 weeks and wanted to check on us one more time. Inside the envelope were family photos from before everything went bad. Pictures of me as a baby with my grandmother, family Christmas cards, normal memories that weren't tainted by blood. He sat at our kitchen table drinking coffee while Naima showed him her fish and the art project she'd made at the school. Before leaving, he told me Naima was the strongest kid he'd ever met in 30 years of police work. Breaking the cycle of violence took courage most adults couldn't manage. He shook my hand and said we were proof that even the darkest family legacies could be overcome. 3 weeks after Detective Strong's visit, Naima brought home a bright yellow paper from the school about joining the art club. She stood in the kitchen doorway holding it out to me while I made dinner, her eyes hopeful but nervous, like she wasn't sure if asking for normal things was okay yet. I took the permission slip and read through it, my throat getting tight when I saw it would be her first after-school activity since everything happened. The art teacher had written a note at the bottom saying Naima showed real talent and would benefit from the structured creative time. I signed it right there at the counter with tears running down my face, not even trying to hide them from Naima, who watched me carefully. She took the paper back and hugged me hard before running to put it in her backpack for tomorrow. The next morning's mail brought a thick envelope with no return address that I almost threw away thinking it was junk. Inside was a handwritten letter on plain paper from a woman whose father had disappeared in 1962. She wrote that the FBI had contacted her family about finding his remains, and while the news was painful, it also brought relief after 60 years of not knowing. She thanked us for breaking the cycle and said she didn't blame us for what our family had done before we were even born. She wrote that it took courage to stop something that had been going on for so long, and she hoped we found peace. I sat at the kitchen table reading it 3 times before putting it in the drawer where I kept important papers, knowing I'd need to read it again on hard days. Adelaide called that afternoon to schedule our monthly session, and mentioned she wanted to discuss reducing Naima's appointments too. We met in her office 2 days later, where she showed me Naima's progress charts, and explained that 6 months without any signs of relapse meant we could step down to monthly maintenance sessions. Naima had developed strong coping skills and was using them independently when she felt stressed or heard strange sounds that might be whispers. Adelaide said this was remarkable progress for a child who'd been through such intensive manipulation and trauma. We celebrated that night with ice cream sundaes at the place downtown that had 20 flavors, and Naima picked 3 different ones, mixing them all together in a mess that made her laugh. We watched a movie on the couch afterward, just a normal evening that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Time moved differently after that, weeks blending into months of regular life that felt precious, because I knew how close we'd come to losing it. 2 years after that horrible night in the basement, Naima's teacher called to tell me she'd won the school's Creative Writing Award for a story about choosing to be good, even when it's hard. The story was about a girl who found a magic box that could grant wishes, but only if she did mean things to get them, and how she decided to throw the box away instead. Her teacher said it showed remarkable empathy and understanding of moral choices for a 9-year-old. At the award ceremony, I watched Naima walk across the stage to get her certificate, and thought about how different this was from that day at Principal Braxton's office with the box of teeth. I met someone at a work conference 6 months later, a man named David who worked in IT and had kind eyes. I told him about our history on our 3rd date, expecting him to run, but he just listened and asked thoughtful questions about how we were doing now. Naima was cautious when I introduced them, watching him closely and staying near me during his visits. Adelaide helped us navigate this new dynamic in our sessions, making sure Naima felt heard and secure. David was patient, never pushing for more interaction than Naima was comfortable with, bringing her books about coding and letting her teach him about her art projects. After 4 months, I found them working together on a simple computer program to make digital art, both of them focused on the screen and talking easily about color combinations. The Memorial Garden dedication happened on a cold Saturday morning 3 years after everything started. The city had turned the lot where our old house stood into a small park with benches and flower beds, each one marked with a small plaque for one of the victims. Naima and I arrived early with bundles of flowers we'd bought at the farmer's market. placing them carefully at each marker while reading the names and dates. Other families started arriving, some crying, some just standing quietly looking at the names of people they'd lost decades ago. A woman approached us and took my hand, saying her mother had disappeared in 1958, and she was grateful we'd ended it. More people thanked us throughout the ceremony, not with anger but with a kind of sad understanding that we were victims too in a different way. Naima stayed close to me the whole time, occasionally squeezing my hand when someone new approached, but she held her head up and met their eyes. When Naima turned 10, we were doing homework at the dining room table when she suddenly looked up from her math worksheet and asked if I thought the lady was still out there somewhere. My pencil stopped moving and I looked at her, seeing genuine curiosity but not fear in her eyes. We talked about how even if she existed in some form, we were stronger now and knew how to protect ourselves from voices that wanted us to hurt people. Naima nodded and said that made sense, then asked if I could help her with the fraction problem that was giving her trouble. She went back to her homework like it was just a normal question, and I realized it kind of was for us now. Adelaide officially discharged Naima from therapy a month later after 3 years without hearing the voice. She'd developed into a thoughtful, creative child who knew how to recognize her triggers and had strong tools for managing them. Adelaide called her one of her greatest success stories, a child who'd overcome something that would break many adults. We kept her number in case we ever needed to come back, but Adelaide was confident we wouldn't. Mr. Henderson passed away peacefully at 91. 4 years after that night, Naima had taken his tooth. His son called to let us know about the funeral and specifically said we were welcome to attend. We sat in the back row of the church, listening to stories about his life and his work as a teacher before he retired. After the service, his son found us and shook my hand, saying his father had never held any anger toward Naima and had understood she was a manipulated child. He said his father had even kept the get well card Naima had sent him years ago, and that forgiveness was possible for everyone. 5 years after finding that secret room, Naima's 8th grade teacher called to tell me she'd submitted Naima's essay about breaking negative family patterns to a district writing contest. The essay didn't mention our specific history, but talked about how every generation has the power to choose differently than the ones before. 2 weeks later, we got the letter saying she'd won 2nd place and was invited to read it at the district ceremony. I sat in the auditorium watching my 13-year-old daughter read her words to a room full of strangers, her voice clear and strong as she talked about choosing love over anger and healing over hurt. When she finished and people applauded, I thought about that scared little girl in the basement holding a box of teeth and couldn't believe how far we'd come. 3 years later, I stood in our apartment kitchen making Naima's favorite breakfast while she practiced her graduation speech at the dining table. She'd been chosen as one of 3 students to speak at the elementary school ceremony next week and had written every word herself. Her therapist still saw her monthly, just quick check-ins now to make sure the voice stayed quiet, and Adelaide always commented on how well she was doing. I watched Naima mouth the words she'd memorized, her face serious with concentration, and thought about how different our life had become. We'd built everything from scratch in this new city. No family secrets buried in the walls, no ghosts teaching lessons in basements. The old house had been demolished years ago, turned into that memorial garden we visited once to leave flowers. Naima's best friend Sarah called to confirm their sleepover plans for after graduation, and I listened to my daughter laugh and make normal kid plans about movies and nail polish. She'd made real friends here, kids who knew nothing about teeth collections or disappeared neighbors, just saw her as the smart girl who was good at math and loved drawing horses. The graduation ceremony arrived on a perfect June morning, the gymnasium decorated with paper flowers the 5th graders had made themselves. I found a seat in the 3rd row and watched Naima walk to the podium in her blue graduation gown, standing tall and confident as she delivered her speech about perseverance and new beginnings. She caught my eye during the part about overcoming challenges and gave me the smallest smile. When they called her name for the honor roll certificate, she walked across that stage surrounded by kids who genuinely liked her, and I knew we'd finally made it through to the other side of our family's darkness. And that's it for today. Nothing too polished, just the story as it happened. Thanks for hanging out with me. It always feels like a relaxed chat. Catch you next time if you swing back.